Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 450 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so honored to have Dr. Jeffrey Post with us to talk to you about his book, The Smithsonian National Gem Collection, Unearthed: Surprising Stories Behind the Jewels. Before we jump in, I want to give you all that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then I'll turn things over to Dr. Post. So we have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you can also submit questions during the presentation by clicking that questions button that's just below the live stream video. There are quite a few of you tuning in today, and we will take as many questions as we can during the Q&A period, so just keep that in mind. And as a reminder, there will be a link to the recording sent out to all registrants in about 24 hours. Now to formally introduce our guest for today. Dr. Jeffrey Post received a Bachelor of Science degrees in Geology and Chemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and his PhD in Chemistry with a specialty in Geochemistry from Arizona State University. Prior to joining the Department of Mineral Sciences at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History in 1984, he was a postdoctoral research fellow for 3 years in the Department of Geological Sciences at Harvard University. He was chairman of the Department of Mineral Sciences from 1989 to 1994 and 2014 to 2019. And from 1991 to 2023, he served as curator in charge of the U.S. National Gem and Mineral Collection. Dr. Post was the lead curator for the Janet Annenberg Hooker Hall of Geology, Gems, and Minerals that opened in 1997. In May 2023, he was appointed research curator emeritus. Welcome, Dr. Post. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you now.
All right. Well, Brandon, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to join you today to share with you some of the spectacular gems and jewelry pieces we have at the Smithsonian Collection, and particularly talk about some of their stories. So I'm going to start, though, with sort of the beginning with gems. Every gemstone begins as a mineral crystal that forms in the earth, such as in this case, in the middle and the back of this image, you see a large diamond crystal. This is a 254 karat diamond from South Africa. And when you take a diamond crystal or any crystal like this, and it's cut and polished and shaped into a gemstone, the way we think about that object suddenly changes dramatically. As a gemstone, we're now thinking about it as perhaps a piece of art, as something that's going to be in a piece of jewelry. We think about its value. We think about its history, its story, its provenance. And I think it's one of the reasons why gems are so fascinating to many of our visitors. Gems continue to be the most popular exhibit that we have at the Museum of Natural History. And I think it's because as objects, they're different than virtually anything else in the museum because of this combination of a natural history story that's something that formed in the earth, but also this human story that goes along with it. And as gems are undiminished with time, basically a gem is forever, they tend to accumulate stories. They tend to move through history, sometimes becoming part of history, sometimes just being a passive observer in history. And invariably, when I hand a gem to someone, the first thing that somebody asks me is, what's its story? Where did it come from? Who owned it? And I think it's that part of the story that in many cases is what makes them especially valuable to us, but make them very fascinating to us. And so what I'd like to do today, or I thought I would do, is to talk a little bit about our gem collection at the Smithsonian Institution, a little bit about its story, about its background, and then focus on a few of the highlights in the collection. And of course, we'll spend a little time talking about our most famous gemstone, which is the Hope Diamond. Well, if you'd visited the Museum of Natural History back in the 1920s, this is the gem and mineral gallery you would have seen at that time. And the flat-topped cases you see going down the center of the gallery are where most of the gems are being displayed. And the gem collection at that time was described as being one of the most extensive public displays of gems anywhere in the United States. But as the curator then commented, alas, was lacking in any of the high value stones or important gems. And he said, even though the administration at the time recognized that it was a very popular exhibit with the public, there just weren't the funds to acquire the important pieces that they'd like to add to the collection. Well, it all changed. Well, and actually, and if also one of the highlights at that time in the collection was this quartz crystal ball. And this went on display in 1925, has been there ever since. It is the largest flawless quartz crystal ball in the world. We'll talk more about it in a few minutes. But this was a very popular part of the exhibit at the time. And you'll notice if you look at that security officer there, you'll see that even then we took security very seriously. Wouldn't want to mess with this guy. But the big change in our collection that really put the wind in our sails to build a modern gem collection at the Smithsonian was the donation in 1958 from Harry Winston of the Hope Diamond. And here you see that presentation. The Hope Diamond came in 1958 and went on exhibit and immediately was a huge hit with the public. The attendance at the museum more than doubled in the next few weeks, and it just became one of these must-see items in Washington, D.C. Well, if the Hope Diamond was sort of what focused attention on our collection and as a place to see gems, what really sort of helped build our collection was then a series of private gifts that came in the 1960s and 70s, in fact, continue today. And one of the most important patrons to help us build that collection at the time was Marjorie Merriweather Post. Was one of the wealthiest women in the United States at that time, was fascinated by gems, and one of her homes is in Washington, D.C., and she loved the idea of a national gem collection and immediately donated a number of items to help build that collection, items that she thought should be shared with the public. She was quite a collector herself. She was fascinated in particular by gems and jewelry pieces that had connections to European royalty. And here she's shown presenting to the administration of the Smithsonian at that time, 1964, the Napoleon diamond necklace. And we'll talk again a little more about that later. You'll notice that the administration of the Smithsonian all looked pretty much the same at that time. Yeah. Well, so the collection then grew through a series of donations into the collection we have today, which is exhibited now in the Museum of Natural History. Of course, this is one of 21 museums that make up the Smithsonian Institution. It's the largest and most visited of all the Smithsonian museums. And still today, the most popular part of the museum is our National Gem Collection. And it's where we have housed behind the scenes the bulk of our collection. This is looking at the mineral collection that we have behind the scenes. This is 375,000 minerals, but included in the collection is about 10,000 gems. Here we see some of those pieces back in our vault. We try to keep most of the gem and mineral pieces that are most exhibitable or most interest to the public on public display. And most of those are displayed in this gallery. This is our National Gem Collection gallery, as you would see it today if you visited the Museum of Natural History. And you see in the foreground, there's still our quartz crystal ball. You see behind it a couple of large topaz crystals we'll talk more about in a few minutes. But this is where we highlight many of the major pieces in the collection. So the collection has grown over the years as a series of gifts of jewelry and gem pieces, but along with the individual pieces, of course, comes their stories. And so we've become a collection not only of the gems and the jewelry pieces, but also of the stories of the people who have owned them or the people who have become part of their history. Well, let's start with our quartz crystal ball. We've seen this now a couple of times. It has been, we say, continuously on display since 1925 and continues to be one of our more popular objects. So this is 106.7 pounds, 12.9-inch diameter quartz crystal ball cut from a natural piece of quartz. It is by far the largest flawless quartz crystal ball in the world. There's nothing even close to it. And as such, it's a natural oddity, the fact that there was a piece of quartz that grew in the earth that was so pure and so perfect that one could cut a crystal ball of this size. And this is in the collection as a gift from Mrs. Worcester Reed Warner. Her husband was an engineer, in fact, who helped to build some of the great telescopes in the United States and around the world in the early 1900s. And he also had an interest in Oriental art. And he became aware of this crystal ball had been brought into the United States in 1924 and was sitting in customs in New York. And it was sitting in customs because the owner of the crystal ball had brought it in, claiming it as an antiquity from China. Well, the customs agent did his usual good job of looking into the history of this crystal ball and determined, in fact, that it had been cut and polished the previous year in Shanghai, China. So certainly was not an antiquity. In fact, went so far as to determine that the original quartz crystals that had been cut from had been found in 1923 in Burma and had been brought into Shanghai, and in fact were used to cut a number of these crystal balls, this being the largest. And so customs then put a big import duty on it. The owner contested it, and it's kind of sat in limbo in customs. Well, Mr. Warner, realizing that this was an exceptional object, something that was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, contacted the secretary of the Smithsonian and said that you should contact customs and see if you can arrange to get this crystal ball on loan, because it's something everybody should have a chance to see. Excuse me. So in fact, the secretary of the Smithsonian was able to make that arrangement with customs. The crystal ball went on exhibit, and eventually Mrs. Warner was able to make an arrangement between the owner of the crystal ball and customs, who wanted to get its cut, to eventually pay off the duty and the price of the ball in order to have it permanently then donated to the Smithsonian. And as I say, it's been there ever since. So it's a spectacular object and one that continues to fascinate us. We saw the picture of Marjorie Merriweather Post presenting this necklace to the Smithsonian secretary and staff in 1964. And this necklace is one that was given by Napoleon to the Empress Marie Louise in 1811 to celebrate the birth of their son. You may recall that Napoleon divorced Josephine because she was not able to provide an heir. And so he then married Marie Louise from the Habsburg family in Austria. And a year later, they had a son, the future King of Rome. So in celebration, he had this necklace commissioned, over 160 carats of diamonds, the largest diamonds, about 10, 11 carats in size, and presented to Marie Louise. Now, keeping in mind that at this time, 1811, diamonds had not yet been found in South Africa. And so there were only diamonds coming from India and Brazil. And most people did not own diamonds. Only very wealthy, powerful people generally owned diamonds. And so to put together a necklace like this is something only a very wealthy person like Napoleon could have done. And of course, this is exactly why he would have done it, was to show off to the world his power and his wealth. Well, after his defeat at Waterloo, rather than following him into exile, Marie Louise decided to go back to her Habsburg family in Austria. And because the necklace was considered to be her personal property, it was taken with her. Eventually, she became the Duchess of Parma in Italy. Here's a portrait, in fact, from 1835 of showing her wearing the necklace. And the necklace was then passed down through her family, the Habsburg family in Austria, until after World War II, when it was then sold to Harry Winston in New York. And Harry Winston, realizing Marjorie Merriweather Post's interest in items such as this, approached her, and she purchased it and then donated it to the Smithsonian collection. Along with the necklace came the original case. This is the coat of arms that is that of Marie Louise's, her royal colors, gold and green, such as this. And so, again, part of the history of this great necklace. Truly one of the great diamond necklaces in history. Also from Marjorie Merriweather Post, this is a gift through her daughter, Eleanor Close Barzin, in 1964, is this pair of earrings with these large diamonds. And according to fairly good circumstantial evidence, these earrings once belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette of France. And the earrings were purchased by Mrs. Post from Pierre Cartier in 1928. And he presented to her at the time an affidavit from Prince Yusupov, a Russian prince, in which he stated that these earrings had been in his family for more than 100 years and always had been documented as the Marie Antoinette earrings. So, like I say, the evidence is somewhat circumstantial, but there is reasonable evidence to suggest that these earrings perhaps belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. So here we see, in fact, a portrait of her wearing large drop diamond earrings. There's nothing that can link these particular earrings with the ones that we have, but it does, in fact, at least indicate that she did own such large earrings. Also, this is a portrait of Princess Tatiana Yusupov. Now, this is the grandmother of Prince Felix Yusupov, who had sold the earrings to Pierre Cartier. Now, Tatiana Yusupov had one of the largest gem collections in Europe in the middle 1800s. And it was her collection that had these earrings. And this is a portrait of her from 1875, shown wearing, again, those same earrings. And again, the documentation indicates that these were the Marie Antoinette earrings. The earrings, the diamonds themselves in the earrings, you can see here, out of the earrings, you can see that the diamonds are, interestingly, very different sized and shaped. But in fact, they're very high quality diamonds, even by today's standards, what they call type 2A diamonds, one of the highest purity type diamonds known. And the cutting style of these diamonds is actually very consistent with what would be expected from the late 1700s. So both the quality, the size of the diamonds, and the cutting style suggest that these, if not Queen Marie Antoinette, would have been owned by somebody very wealthy, somebody very important at that time. Another gift from Marjorie Merriweather Post is this fabulous blue diamond. Now, our collection is most known for our other big blue diamond, the Hope Diamond. And this diamond, called the Blue Heart because of its shape, is about 2/3 the size of the Hope Diamond. But as Mrs. Post always liked to remind her friends, this was the most beautiful blue diamond that we had, and largely because of the more modern cut on this stone. This is a diamond that was originally mined in South Africa in the Premier Mine in 1908, and it was a little over 100 carats when it was found. It was then cut and polished and eventually sold by Pierre Cartier to a family in Argentina, the Unsue family. And the diamond was set in a necklace, actually a sort of a corsage brooch necklace called a Lily of the Valley corsage brooch. And the black and white image on the left, you see in the center the blue heart diamond. And then what you don't see in the black and white image is above it are two other colored diamonds. There's a small pink diamond and then another triangular shaped blue diamond. So truly a spectacular piece of jewelry. So it stayed in the Unsue family. She eventually gave it to her niece as a wedding gift. And then in 1949, she sold the necklace to Van Cleef and Arpels. They reset the colored diamonds into the necklace, as you see here. Now you can see the two blue diamonds, the pink diamond, and it was sold to a European industrialist. Well, he gave this necklace to his new bride at the time. Turns out they were married for less than a year, so they got divorced, but of course she kept the necklace. So it would seem to me that perhaps there is a bit of a lesson there. If you're going to give an important piece of jewelry, you might want to wait until at least your first anniversary, or at least know until the marriage is a little bit more solid. But eventually then she sold the blue diamond to, again, Harry Winston, and ultimately Harry Winston sold it to Marjorie Merriweather Post. One of the world's great sapphires is the Logan sapphire in our collection. This 423 carat sapphire from Sri Lanka is about the size of a large chicken egg. And it's set here as a brooch, but also can be worn as a necklace. Well, this sapphire was given to the collection by Polly Logan. Now, Polly Logan was a fairly well-known socialite in the Washington, D.C. area. Her second husband was Robert Guggenheim. And by all accounts, Mr. Guggenheim was a bit of a philanderer. And so apparently he had many occasions to have to come up with a makeup gift. And one of those in the early 1950s was this large sapphire. And it became Polly Logan's sort of signature piece. She was known to wear it at virtually all formal or major occasions in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, eventually she tired of Mr. Guggenheim and divorced him. And after that, about 1960, she gave the sapphire to our collection at the Smithsonian. And when asked at that time why she decided to give that sapphire to the collection, she just commented, she said, she said, every time I wear this sapphire, all I could think about was my former cheating, no good husband. And I just decided it was time to get all of those bad memories out of my life. And so part of that was giving away the sapphire. So we were happy to help her out. And obviously we're still happy to help out with those kinds of occasions. We have another great sapphire in the collection. This 98.6 carat sapphire originally came from Burma, and as such is one of the great sapphires in the world. It's shown here set in a Art Deco type mounting that was done by Cartier in the 1950s. And it was set for the Countess Mona Bismarck, who gave this sapphire to the collection. So the Countess Mona Bismarck, interesting lady. She was the daughter of a horse trainer in Lexington, Kentucky. And she built a great gem collection and a great wealth in the tried and true method. She married early, she married often, and she married well. Her sixth husband was a count, so she became a countess. And she spent much of her life living in a very beautiful villa on the island of Caprice off of the coast of Italy. And there she would entertain many of the luminaries, the high society people of the world, and was by all accounts a lovely lady. In fact, she was the first woman designated by French designers as the world's best dressed woman. And so in the early 60s, she decided to give this sapphire to the growing National Gem Collection at the Smithsonian. The largest faceted diamond we have in our collection is this diamond called the Portuguese diamond at 127.01 carats. Beautiful stone. Well, it turns out the name is a bit of a misnomer. This is a diamond that was once owned for a while by Harry Winston, and he traveled it around in the 1940s and 50s as part of what he called his Court of Jewels exhibit around the United States. And he needed a good story, he thought, for this diamond. And so, he never let the lack of a story prevent him from coming up with one. And so his story became that this was a diamond that came out of Brazil and was therefore eventually the property of the Portuguese royal family. And so he called it the Portuguese diamond. Well, as we know now, this has no connection to Brazil or Portugal. In fact, the diamond was mined in South Africa in 1910, was then cut in Antwerp, and eventually then recut in New York City in early 1900s. And it was eventually then sold to this woman, Peggy Hopkins Joyce. Now, I'd be curious to find out how many of you out there have ever heard of Peggy Hopkins Joyce. It's not a household name today, but in fact, in the early 1920s, she was one of the best known women in the United States. She had been a Ziegfeld Follies girl, and she became the darling of the tabloid newspapers in New York. And many women in the United States sort of lived a bit vicariously through her exploits. She was known as the much married, much divorced Peggy Hopkins Joyce. In her autobiography, she claimed to have been engaged to at least 50 different men in her life. And she loved to share her various dalliances and exploits with the tabloid newspapers, and they loved to tell her story. And so she became a regular feature for many years in the 1920s, and also was much photographed in Vanity Fair magazine. So after one of her divorces, she went down to Black Star and Frost on Broadway and bought this diamond. At the time, it was thought to be the largest diamond in private ownership in the world. It was known in the tabloids as Peggy's skating rink. And it was said that whenever she went out, she always had security people walking around with her. Well, as you can imagine, for someone whose fame and fortune depended much on sort of their good looks, their reputation, their sort of interest by the public, it's something that doesn't last. And she herself, in one of her articles in Vanity Fair, commented that there'll come a time when no one will ever remember Peggy Hopkins Joyce, but she said what they will remember is that I owned this large diamond. And it's kind of a Prussian thing. Curiously, for now and probably long into the future, many generations will only know about or perhaps hear about Peggy Hopkins Joyce because of the fact that she once owned this great diamond, and her story is now permanently a part of the story of that diamond. And here's another look at this Portuguese diamond. It was remounted temporarily for a Life magazine photo shoot that was done in the 1990s. And here it's mounted as a hat pin and being modeled by Michelle Pfeiffer, the actress. In fact, we did a photo shoot of her wearing a number of pieces from our collection, and this is just one of those. But it looks pretty good here too. And so the story of this diamond just continues. One of the great emeralds in our collection is this one, known as the Hooker Emerald. And we always have to say, named after the person who gave it, not the profession. It was a gift to the collection from Janet Annenberg Hooker in 1977. It's a 75.5 carat diamond emerald from Colombia. And it's noteworthy because of its large size and its clarity. It's a beautiful color, beautiful clean stone, unusual for emeralds from Colombia. And it's shown here in a Tiffany setting. Well, this emerald was acquired by Tiffany and Company from an auction of this gentleman, the Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He was the last all-powerful leader of the Ottoman Empire. But after the uprising of the Young Turks in 1908, he was forced to flee and then to live and to support his family by selling off his gems, his jewelry, and other possessions. And there was an auction in Paris in 1911, and one of the pieces that was sold was this emerald. It was said that at the time that emerald was one that he used to wear in his belt buckle. And it was purchased at the auction by Tiffany and Company, and they then originally set it into a tiara, and it was shown in that tiara setting in the House of Jewels, the 1939 New York World's Fair. And in fact, Mrs. Hooker saw this emerald at that time at the World's Fair. And so then later, when it was reset and now featured in the 1950 Tiffany catalog, she immediately recognized it and then purchased the emerald. And then again, in 1977, gave it to our collection. The second largest diamond in our collection is this champagne-colored diamond. It's called the Victoria Transvaal diamond, about 68 carats in size. And it was a gift to the collection from Leonard and Victoria Wilkinson. This diamond was cut from a larger stone that was found in South Africa, the Transvaal area of South Africa, in about 1950. And it was cut by Baumgold Brothers, who are a company in New York. And at the time, if you wanted to, make a diamond, make a reputation for a diamond to sort of get people interested in it, you didn't have the internet. You couldn't just put it up on Instagram. You couldn't put it on TikTok or whatever. The way that you would get interest in a diamond is you traveled around the country, or you would get it perhaps in the newspapers or maybe in the movies. And so this is one of those Hollywood classics, 1951, called Tarzan's Savage Fury. And it's a Tarzan movie featuring Lex Barker and Dorothy Hart as Jane. And in the movie, here's Dorothy Hart wearing the Victoria Transvaal diamond, or at that time known as the Transvaal diamond. And so all part of a promotion for this diamond. Eventually, even in the 1960s, it was featured in a TV program. Some of you might remember a TV series at the time called Ironsides. And so this diamond was featured in one of those episodes. Eventually, it was sold at auction, and it was purchased by Leonard Wilkinson. And he was a lumber mill magnate in the Northwest, but he purchased a diamond and then donated it to the Smithsonian. He said he wanted to do it in honor of his wife, who was the love of his life. So in the end, a love story that brought the diamond to the Smithsonian. The Star of Bombay is a star sapphire from Sri Lanka that was given to the collection as a bequest from Mary Pickford in 1979. So a star sapphire is simply so it turns out ruby and sapphire are both gem varieties of the mineral corundum, aluminum oxide. And if it's blue, it's a sapphire. In fact, blue or any other color, it's sapphire. If it's red, it's called a ruby. And if there's inclusions of the mineral rutile that align just properly inside that crystal of sapphire, when it's cut and polished, the light reflecting off of those needles of rutile inside the stone give you the bands of light that intersect to form the star. So it's entirely a natural phenomena that's enhanced by the way it's cut and polished. And so this star sapphire is one that belonged to Mary Pickford. She was known as the darling of the silent films, the 1920s, 1930s, also became actually quite a well-known, successful film executive. But after her divorce from Douglas Fairbanks Jr., another actor, she went down to her local jewelry store and she bought a suite of star sapphire jewelry that was all in style at the time. And in fact, the picture on the right shows her wearing a brooch that has this sapphire in it, the Star of Bombay, it was called. Also, if you're a fan of gin and tonics, in fact, you may then be familiar with Bombay Sapphire Gin. In fact, the name of that gin, in fact, you see the picture on the front of it, is in fact this stone. So, as we said, rubies are simply the red gem variety of corundum. So if you can get star sapphires, you can also get star rubies. And this is one of the world's great star rubies. It's from Sri Lanka, 139 carats. And it was a gift to the collection from Mr. Rosser Reeves in the 1960s. So Rosser Reeves, he was the head of the Ted Bates advertising agency in New York. And he was known for sort of really promoting or advertising using slogans. And so if you're familiar with the slogan, M&M's melts in your mouth, not in your hand, or Wonder Bread builds bodies in 12 different ways. These are the kinds of slogans that had been instituted by Rosser Reeves, and this was sort of his brainchild. Well, he bought this ruby as sort of a good luck charm. He liked to carry it around in his pocket. And turns out that in 1963, he ended up having lunch at the Harvard Club in New York with the former curator of the Smithsonian Collection, George Switzer. And they had lunch, and perhaps more importantly, had then a number of drinks after lunch. And by the end of the afternoon, Switzer had convinced Rosser Reeves to donate the stone to the Smithsonian Collection. And George Switzer said what finally convinced him was he just loved the idea, being an advertising guy, that this stone would always be known to the public as the Rosser Reeves Ruby. And he just loved that alliteration. So if you're ever invited to lunch by a Smithsonian curator, be careful, especially if you have an important gemstone. So we also have another great ruby in the collection. This is a more recent addition to the collection. This is a ruby from Burma. And Burma is the source, even today, of some of the world's great rubies. This is a stone that's 23 carats, and as such is one of the world's largest and finest known Burmese rubies. It was mined in the 1930s. It was then sold to a European family, but eventually ended up in a safety deposit box where it sat for several decades. Eventually, the owners decided it was time to sell the ruby, and it was then purchased for the collection by Dr. Peter Buck, and he purchased it in memory of his wife, Carmen Lucia, who had recently passed away from cancer. Well, it turns out that Peter Buck, when I met him, he was originally was a professor of a small college in Connecticut. But then one summer, he and a young fellow at a family picnic were looking for a way to perhaps raise a little money to help this young guy pay for his college tuition, and they decided to open a sandwich shop. Well, eventually that sandwich shop grew into Subway restaurants. So it turns out Peter Buck was the co-founder of Subway restaurants. And so that's how he was able to purchase this ruby for us then and donate it to the collection. Another recent gift to the collection is this large aquamarine gem. It's known as the Don Pedro aquamarine. And this was cut from a crystal that weighed over 100 pounds that was mined in Brazil in the 1980s, one of the largest, finest known aquamarine gem crystals ever found. And a large portion of the crystal went to Eder Oberstein, Germany. And there, a gem cutter named Bernd Moonsteiner decided that rather than just cut this into a bunch of small gemstones that would be featured in jewelry, that it would be cut into a large piece. And his vision as an artist was to create a gem piece that was the art itself, not something to be mounted in jewelry. And so he created this piece standing over 14 inches tall weighing 10,395 carats, one of the largest, finest pieces of aquamarine known. And he used what he calls a fantasy cut. These are cuts into the back sides of the stone that reflect the light, giving it this great luminosity. And you can see on the left the superposition of the cut stone on the original crystal to show how it was cut from that crystal. As one of the gem dealers in Eder Oberstein liked to say, when you look at a crystal like this, he said, you had to cut something large. He said, what nature makes large, he said, man should not make small. So from this large crystal, he said, you could only cut something large. And this is the piece that came out. And it was a gift to the collection then from Jane Mitchell and Jeff Bland. You may recall seeing in the picture of the Gem Collection gallery a while back, 2 large topaz crystals. And these topaz crystals are shown here with the daughter of our photographer for scale. She doesn't actually, sit in the case each day, but she did pose for the picture. And it shows you the size of these crystals. The largest one on her left is 112 pounds. These crystals came from Brazil. Again, just to remind our visitors as they're looking at the gem collection that all of our gems start out as mineral crystals that formed in the earth. And if you have large crystals, by gosh, you can cut large gemstones. And that gemstone in front of her is our largest faceted gem. It is just under 23,000 carats, or a little over 10 pounds. It's known as the American golden topaz. And for many, many years, it was the largest known gemstone in the world. There is now one that was cut larger topaz, that is in a museum in Spain. But this was a gift to our collection from the Rockhound Hobbyists of America, and then Drs. Marie and Ed Borgata in 1988. And truly a beautiful gemstone. Well, as we mentioned earlier, the most famous gemstone in our collection, what really launched our modern gem collection, is the Hope Diamond. This blue diamond shown here in a setting that was done by Cartier in about 1911. And this gem continues to draw huge crowds into the museum. This is typically how our Hope Diamond Gallery looks each day. And for a lot of our visitors, I think when they see the Hope Diamond initially, they're a bit puzzled. They all heard of the Hope Diamond, they all want to see it. And I think one of the common misconceptions is that they're coming to see the world's largest diamond, which of course it's not. The world's largest diamond, in fact, is the Brown Jubilee. It belongs to the King of Thailand. It's over 550 carats in size. The Hope Diamond is less than 1/10 that size. So already people are going, well, it's a whole lot smaller than we thought. I mean, they're expecting something the size of a golf ball. Instead, they're finding a diamond that's only about 1 inch in diameter. And then it's blue. And, whoever heard of a blue diamond? And so at that point, they're thinking, well, what's the story? What's the big deal about this diamond? So, of course, part of our job is to explain to them, to tell them why this diamond is, in fact, so valuable and so significant. And so part of it is because of the blue color. It is, in fact, one of the largest, finest known blue diamonds in the world. And as such, is one of the rarest objects produced by the earth. Blue diamonds are found or form deeper in the earth than most other diamonds, and as such are truly rare and unusual objects and of actually great scientific interest. So for no other reason, just the fact it's a large blue diamond would make this really important. But of course, beyond that, it has a story associated with it. And really, it's the history, the story behind this blue diamond that makes it so interesting for a lot of people. And because of that story, because of the rare blue color, it's also one of the most valuable objects on the earth. In fact, many people have claimed this may be the most valuable object per volume of anything in the world. Just to give you an idea, one of the most common questions that we get, of course, is how much is it worth? And the honest answer is we really don't know. The only way you'd find out, of course, is if you put it up for auction and see what somebody's willing to pay for it. And of course, we're not going to do that. But to give you an idea, blue diamonds, even without any provenance or any history, are selling at auction these days for anywhere between $3 and $4 million per carat. So it gives you an idea of the value of a blue diamond. Well, this one does have a story. And of course, that's what most people are really interested in, is what's the story? And part of the reason, ironically, we know the story of this diamond as well as we do is because it's a large, rare blue diamond. It's hard to hide a blue diamond in history. As a blue diamond moved around, even historically, they were always unusual. They would be noticed. They tend to be documented. White diamonds, as they move around, if they're recut, they're stolen, they're sold, whatever, they tend to sort of fall into, they just sort of disappear into the background of other white diamonds. But a blue diamond is hard to hide in history. So what do we know about this? Well, I'm going to give you the short version. I mean, books have been written, movies have been done. This could be the subject of a whole talk, but just the sort of the quick version of the history of this diamond. So what we know is this diamond was brought to France in 1668 by this gentleman, John Baptiste Tavernier. Tavernier was a merchant who would travel between Europe and India. And in India, he would buy up gems and spices and silks and all kinds of valuable things that he would then bring back to Europe and sell, hopefully at a profit. And so over the years, he made several of these voyages to India, but on his last one, he returned to France and brought a collection of diamonds that he showed to King Louis XIV. And in his journal that he later wrote about his travels, he included a plate, a drawing of these diamonds that he showed to King Louis XIV. And the one in particular we're interested in, the upper left, this is 3 different sketches of the same diamond that weighs about 115 modern metric carats, and it's described as being a deep blue color. Well, all of these diamonds were purchased by King Louis XIV. And the blue diamond in particular, he had recut, and it was recut into a triangular shape down to about 69 metric carats. And it's shown here set into a very elaborate emblem of the Order of the Golden Fleece. It was done by King Louis XV. The Order of the Golden Fleece was an order of knighthood that included all of the important crown heads of Europe. And of course, the French king, being the wealthiest, the most powerful of these crown heads at the time, would have the most elaborate of these emblems of the Order of the Golden Fleece. So in addition to the blue diamond, there was also a carved red spinel carved into the shape of a dragon. This is the Cote de Bretagne, which is a very important historic gem in France, and then a number of other large white diamonds. So a very spectacular piece of jewelry. Well, it was in this form in 1792 when, during the French Revolution, the French crown jewels were put into a special warehouse in Paris for safekeeping, because there was concern by the now revolutionary government that the king and queen might try to flee the country and take the crown jewels with them. But in September of 1792, there was a theft. There was a group of thieves broke into this warehouse, and they took many of the important crown jewels. Well, ironically, turns out the theft wasn't detected, so the thieves came back the second night and took more things, and it turns out this went on for 5 nights. Only after the 5th night was the theft detected, and of course, by then, everything was gone. Well, eventually, most of the crown jewels were recovered in and around Paris. However, one piece that was never seen again is this emblem of the Order of the Golden Fleece, and of course, within it, the blue diamond. Looking back now, we have pretty good evidence to indicate that this was taken the first night of the theft, taken out of France, and taken to London. London was the major gem cutting center in Europe at that time. Well, the next thing we know about the next event in this history of this blue diamond, we think, is this memorandum 20 years later, 1812, in London. This memorandum is written by an English jeweler, a man named Francione, who describes the blue diamond, a new blue diamond, no history, no past, being offered for sale by a man named Daniel Eliasson in London. And the description of this diamond, the shape, the size, the weight, matches exactly the stone that we have today as the Hope diamond. So this is the first documented evidence of the diamond we have in our collection, the Hope diamond. And now looking back with some modern perspective and other evidence we have, we're almost positive that this is the recut version of the French blue diamond. Interestingly, its appearance 20 years after its theft corresponds to a time during which there is an amnesty after 20 years in France for the crime of theft. And so it may be that then this diamond was now being offered for sale in London, realizing that the French government could not, in fact, try to reclaim the stone. So the diamond then was purchased by Henry Philip Hope in 1821, and it stayed in his collection until his death in 1839. Hope was a banker who also had one of the best gem collections in Europe at the time. And you see in the lower left the diamond as it was set in his collection. It was then passed down through his family in England until the late 1800s, and eventually his great-grandnephew was forced to sell the diamond. He was having some financial problems. It then changed hands several times, but eventually was acquired by Pierre Cartier in Paris. Well, one of Pierre Cartier's best customers is this woman, Evelyn Walsh McLean. Evelyn Walsh McLean was a wealthy socialite in Washington, D.C. Her father had struck it rich mining gold in Colorado, and so he moved the family to Washington, D.C. She married the son of the owner of the Washington Post newspaper, Ned McLean, and together they would travel around Europe and, of course, would stop in to see Pierre Cartier in Paris and occasionally buy a piece of jewelry. Well, on one of those visits, he showed her the Hope diamond. Well, she declined to buy it at the time. All indications are they'd already spent all of their parents' money on that particular trip. But Cartier, not one to give up easily, had the diamond taken out of the old setting, brought it to New York, put it in a new setting, brought it down to Washington, D.C., left it with her and said, just wear it around the house for a couple days and then let's talk. Well, turned out to be a very successful sales strategy. She decided she must own this diamond and arranged to purchase it from Cartier. Well, it's also about this time that we first start hearing about any stories relating to this diamond, it being bad luck or having a curse on it. And when you look back historically, there's no such mention of these stories until the early 1900s. And it's pretty, and in fact, the first mention we can find are a couple of newspaper articles in New York tabloids in the early 1900s. And at that time, it was owned by the diamond was owned by a New York jewelry firm. And it was during a recession, and they were having a hard time finding a buyer for this expensive blue diamond. And so it's pretty clear that the stories came out in the newspaper as an attempt to stir up some interest in this diamond. Any publicity is good publicity. And so there was all these sort of crazy stories about the bad luck and the supposed things that happened to people who owned it, almost none of it being true, but it certainly got people's interest. Well, these stories, of course, continued to get better and to be told. And it turns out that Evelyn Walsh McLean herself liked to tell these stories. In fact, she often would proclaim that, things that were bad luck for other people were good luck for her. And it became her signature piece. This was a piece that it's hard to find a picture of her not wearing the Hope diamond. And in these pictures here, the one on the right in particular, if you look carefully, you'll see that just behind the baby she's holding, there are two other diamonds hanging below the Hope diamond. There's the 35 carat McLean diamond, and then below that, the 95 carat Star of the East. Well, Evelyn Walsh McLean, despite her wealth, had a number of unfortunate things happen in her life. And of course, these just fed into the whole curse story. Her son was killed at an early age in an automobile accident. Her daughter committed suicide. Her husband ended up in an insane asylum. And she herself died, in many ways, a very unhappy woman at a relatively early age. And so for people who like to believe in curses, they just go, well, look at all these terrible things that happened to this wealthy lady. Of course, it must be the diamond. Well, after her death in 1946, Harry Winston then bought her jewelry from her estate, including the Hope diamond. He then traveled it around the country, again, as part of his Court of Jewels exhibit. And during that time, a lot of people saw the Hope diamond. In fact, interestingly, a lot of people got a chance to wear the Hope diamond. I always found it fascinating when I was curator, the number of people that reached out to me telling me that, a family member had wore the Hope diamond, sometimes sending pictures of their mother or grandmother or whatever wearing the Hope diamond. And again, this was part of Harry Winston's promotion of his brand and of many of his jewelry pieces. He traveled them around the country. He would put on shows in various cities at local jewelry stores. And during the time that he was there, he'd have some local luminary, maybe the wife of the mayor or the local fair queen or prom queen, wear the Hope diamond. And then, of course, her picture would be in the newspaper, and it was all good for publicity for Harry Winston. So by the time Harry Winston decided to give this diamond to the Smithsonian in 1958, it was a fairly well-known stone. A lot of people had seen it. And so Harry Winston, of course, could have just simply walked into the Smithsonian with the diamond in his pocket and handed it off very quietly to us, but that was not his style. Instead, Harry Winston put it in the mail and insured it for $1 million and arranged to have it delivered the next day to the Smithsonian Museum, the Natural History Museum, by the local postman. And you see in the lower left the arrival of the package, and it was then opened and put on public display. Well, we've continued to try to fill in some of the history behind the Hope Diamond because it is one that's so rich, and of course, people are really fascinated by it. And one of the recent discoveries that's helped us to learn a little more about the diamond was done by a colleague of mine, Francois Farge, and his colleagues at the Natural History Museum in Paris. And they found in their collection a lead model of the original French blue diamond, the diamond when it was owned by King Louis XIV. And with that lead model, for the first time, we could know exactly the proportions, the faceting pattern, the size of that blue diamond when it was part of the French crown jewels. And so he brought the lead model to the Smithsonian, and we put the lead model next to the Hope Diamond, as you see here. And the dotted line represents our best indication of how we think the Hope Diamond likely was cut from the French blue. We've since done some very detailed computer modeling studies that, in our opinion, almost conclusively show that, yes, in fact, the Hope Diamond was cut from the French blue diamond. So with the information from the lead model, but also the optical information from the Hope Diamond itself, those pieces of information combined allowed Francois to generate this computer rendering of what we think this diamond looked like when it was owned by King Louis XIV. In one of the archives, he had found a description of the diamond at the time being mounted with a gold backing on a gold stick. It was not mounted for a piece of jewelry, but rather something that could be held and shown by the king. It was kept in his cabinet of curiosities in Versailles. And one of the things that was curious when we were looking at the model of the diamond is that the diamond was beautifully cut. I mean, they really knew how to cut diamonds at that time. But one odd thing was the back facets, the back flat facet, the culet facet, and then the star facets around it were cut unusually shallow. And when you cut these facets too shallow, the angle is too low, what happens is rather than reflecting light back out of the diamond to make it more brilliant, it lets light pass right through the diamond, almost like a window through the diamond. And sort of thinking, why in the world would a jeweler do that? Why would a cutter cut those facets that way? Because all it's going to do is diminish the brilliance of the diamond. Well, going back, though, to the description of how the diamond was mounted, Francois added a gold backing to the computer rendering. And what we noticed then was that now these back facets, the culet and the star facets around it, are looking through or showing us that gold backing. And so the effect is this blue diamond with a gold star in the center of it. And we think not just a gold star, but in fact, a gold sun. Because keep in mind, King Louis XIV was the Sun King. And everywhere in Versailles, you see the symbol of the sun. And his official colors were blue and gold. And so we think the court jeweler very cleverly cut and mounted this diamond so that when presented to the king, it showed him his blue and gold colors, but with a gold sun in the center of this blue diamond. And you can imagine what an effect that would be, not only to the king, but to his visitors, and sort of all fits into this sense of the king being divine, this king having special powers. You can imagine this blue diamond with his symbol, the sun, inside of it. So again, gems not just being something of value to show off, but also representing power, representing wealth for royalty. And here's then a summary. These are the history, we think, the cutting history of the Hope Diamond, shown here in CZ, cubic zirconia, but cut according to the best information we have about each of these stones and following the color from the Hope Diamond today. So on the left is the stone as it came out of India, 115 metric carats, then recut for King Louis XIV in the center, the French blue diamond, and then after it was stolen, recut again into the Hope Diamond on the right, which is the stone we have at the museum today. And our modeling studies all suggest that anything removed from the diamond was ground away. There are, in fact, no chips or pieces out there that would still be part of the original diamond. And finally, just wanted to, so when you have the Hope Diamond, there's always a lot of interest and a lot of interesting things that happen being curated with the Hope Diamond around. Well, I mentioned that we did a photo shoot with Michelle Pfeiffer, the actress for Life magazine in the mid-1990s. And so, of course, one of the pieces that she modeled on the left is the Hope Diamond. Looks pretty good. And then not many years ago, Miss Piggy from the Muppets joined the collection at the American Museum of the American History Museum at the Smithsonian. And the director of that museum then called me and said, you know, Miss Piggy would really like to wear the Hope Diamond. Is that possible? So we said, well, sure. So he brought Miss Piggy over and we put the Hope Diamond on her. And there on the right, you see Miss Piggy showing off all of her best fashion, including the Hope Diamond. So you never know what's going to happen when the Hope Diamond's around. And of course, like all other gems, it's a diamond that is just continuing to add to its history. Finally, I just wanted to finish by showing a couple of quick pictures of some new things we've added to the collection recently. This is a new topaz that came into the collection, the Whitney Flame from Brazil. We also have this beautiful brooch that features a number of sapphires from Yogo, Montana. These were mined about 1900. Absolutely gorgeous piece showing these beautiful Montana sapphires. And then finally, recently, this big, beautiful green Savarite garnet that was donated to us, 116 carats from Tanzania. Absolutely spectacular green stone. So all part of the collection continuing to grow. And again, continuing to grow primarily from gifts from individuals. And remember, again, along with these stones come their stories. And so their stories now continue as part of the Smithsonian National Gem Collection. And who knows what will be coming next into our collection. And of course, our crystal ball perhaps can help us there. But it's fun to imagine how this collection will continue to grow. And if you're interested, as mentioned, recently we published a book called The Smithsonian National Gem Collection, Unearthed, the surprising story behind the jewels. If the stories you've heard today are interesting or fascinating to you, they're just a few of the stories that have become part of this collection and that show off so the pieces and their stories are highlighted in this book, and one that you might enjoy if in fact you enjoy the gems, and hopefully might encourage you to actually come visit us at the Smithsonian and see these gems in person. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the great pieces in our collection and their stories. And now I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, so I think you forgot to tell everybody that if they come to the Smithsonian to see the National Gem Collection, you're continuing the Winston tradition of letting us try it on, right?
Well, you'll have to talk to the people there now. Our security officers look a little bit down on that particular idea. I think it's a great idea, but I'm guessing our security people won't go along with that.
We did have several questions about the kind of the red fluorescence that comes from the Hope Diamond.
Oh, the Hope Diamond, yeah. So it's technically, in fact, a phenomenon called phosphorescence, which actually is related to fluorescence, but it's one that whereas fluorescence is a illumination that happens when you shine an ultraviolet light on an object in a dark room, and the ultraviolet light causes that object to glow. So when it's glowing, and if you turn off the light and the glowing stops, that's fluorescent. But if you turn off the light and the glow continues, that's called phosphorescence. And that's what happens with the Hope Diamond. So if we're in a dark room, we put an ultraviolet light on it and then turn off the ultraviolet light, it will glow this sort of ember orange color for almost a minute. And it's kind of an eerie phenomena. And of course, for people who like to believe in curses, it's like, oh my gosh, it glows this blood red color. It makes it even better than you could ever imagine. But it turns out we actually, during the time I was there, did some research on this. One of the great things about having a diamond in our collection is, as a scientist, we can also do research on it. And we determined that the same impurity that gives rise to the blue color also causes this phosphorescence. And the impurity is the element boron. Diamonds are almost always very pure materials, but it turns out that boron, the part, we're talking about like half a part per million of boron, a very tiny amount of boron, is just enough to give it the blue color, but also cause the phosphorescence.
Okay, thank you very much for that explanation. We don't have a lot of time for questions, so I'm going to ask just two more. One being, we had so many people asking, what has been your favorite gem to work with?
Oh gosh, I can always say it's kind of like your kids, right? They're all your favorite, and whichever one is being particularly good that day is the one that you like the best. But every gem has its own story that makes it beautiful. But it's hard to to not say the Hope Diamond. And it may seem like an obvious one, but when I was curator for almost, I was there for almost 40 years and curator for much of that time. It's just a gemstone that keeps being part of your life every day. Part of it is the security that you're dealing with. Part of it is the questions and the fascination, but also the rich history, both natural history and human history, that always is sort of beckoning at you to try to help answer, fill in part of that story. And so the opportunity to do that was really, to me, a very fascinating thing. And, every time I'd hold that diamond in my hand, I'm looking at that 1-inch blue diamond, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, think of all of the history, all of the people, all of the wealth, all of the interest in this 1-inch blue diamond in my hand. And you got to think, is there anything else in the world that has so much attached to it, so much, associated with it? And it kind of makes you realize that, gems are truly something special.
Absolutely. Well, I think I want to close with Marnie's question from Orange County Library System. Marnie says, my 9-year-old loves rocks and gems, and he is here with us today to learn more. What advice do you have for young students interested in studying geology, or maybe some great field trips to take the children to explore the Smithsonian National Gem Collection, of course?
Well, of course. Well, first of all, great that you have that interest. I mean, I started out, one of these kids coming home with rocks in my pocket all the time, and that's a good way to start. There's rocks everywhere, and picking one up and just looking at it, and then asking somebody to tell you its story is always a good way to start. There are books, obviously, museum displays. One of the great things about being associated with the Smithsonian was I loved to go out into the galleries when there was full of people, and particularly families and kids, and watch them discover minerals, in many cases for the first time. And they're standing in front of these cases and seeing crystals that came out of the earth and realizing that's the way they formed, that's the way they came out of the earth. It's almost always a pretty exciting moment for a lot of people. So I think going to museum collections and seeing these things and realizing that these things came out of the earth and that they have a story, it makes the earth a little more of a magical place. It makes it, a place that's kind of fun to want to learn more about. And so I think that, again, the great thing about rocks is that every vacation I've ever been on, or I've taken my kids on, they know there's rocks everywhere. And so look at them. And, if it's, you're not in a national park or someplace where you shouldn't do it, pick up a stone, pick up something off the beach, and take it to somebody at the museum or a local school or a teacher, and just say, hey, tell me the story of this rock. And I think you'll find that, the stories are fascinating ones. And, whether you follow it as a profession, become a geologist, or just are an interested person who wants to learn more about the earth, or just, pick up something and find it interesting. I think, a little interest in geology and rocks is something that sort of lives in all of us.
Yeah. Well, you certainly garnered a lot of interest in geology and rocks today. So thank you so much. It was such a dazzling way to start an open December. So I appreciate you. Sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you very much.
Well, again, my pleasure. And I appreciate people taking the time to listen. As you can tell, it's been a passion for me, and I just feel so special to have been associated with this collection and all these great pieces. But the stories continue. So I hope people will visit the museum or learn more about these and, find their own gems with their own stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to echo that and extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers. None of this would be possible without your support. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video in the resources area, if you keep scrolling down a little bit, you can find a link to the Smithsonian National Gem Collection, Unearthed: Surprising Stories Behind the Jewels. We look forward to everyone joining us next week on December 11th for our last talk of 2024, when we talk to best-selling author Laura Dave about her new book, The Night We Lost Him. Be sure to register for this and lots of other events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.